G'day guys, Ryan Pickles here, and on this episode of Pickels Pickles, we're going to continue our exploration into fermentation and make sourdough bread from scratch. When you make bread, you need your dough, and then you need something to make that dough rise. Now that's called a leavening agent, and typically it's some kind of yeast. These days, that's usually a commercially produced yeast product, but before those were around, bakers had to create their own leavening agents by culturing them from flour. And that's what a sourdough starter is. It's a mixture of flour and water, which contains all the yeast and bacteria necessary to ferment dough and allow it to be baked into bread. Now some bakeries will give you some starter if you ask nicely, but it's also really easy to make your own. All you need is some flour, some water, and a little bit of patience. In the flour, there'll be spores of wild yeast and also some bacteria. And when we hydrate it with water, it'll create the environment that's necessary for those organisms to proliferate. They'll use the carbohydrates in the flour as food, and as they do, they'll make a couple of byproducts. They'll make lactic acid, which is what gives sourdough its characteristic tangy flavour. And they'll also make little bubbles of carbon dioxide, which is actually what will allow your loaf of bread to rise. You can use any type of flour for your starter, but it's best to match it roughly with the types of flour that you're going to be using in your bread. I use a mix of 50% white and 50% wholemeal flour. I've read that wholemeal flour has a pretty good variety of microorganisms, carbohydrates and minerals, which will help to support a diverse and robust culture. It's also a good idea to use organic flour if you can. It's a bit less processed and it should retain more yeast spores and bacteria and set you up with the best chance to get your starter going as easily as possible. So on day one, add a total of 50 grams flour, then add 50 ml water, and mix together until there's no dry spots. And cover with a piece of cheesecloth or loosely cover with a lid and leave overnight. Now the idea is to come back every day and add more flour and water, and that'll give the yeast and bacteria the food they need to grow and take hold. And the next day we're going to add another total 50 grams of flour and 50 ml of water. Now from day 3, we're going to start using a basic rule of thumb that it's a good idea to follow when you're feeding your starter, and that's to use equal parts of starter, flour and water. So in total so far we've added 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water to give us a total of 200 grams of starter. So we'll start by discarding 100 grams of that, so we've got 100 grams of starter remaining. Then we'll add 100 grams of flour and 100 ml of water. And you can actually see that by day 4, we've already got little bubbles of carbon dioxide that are forming at the bottom of the starter and coming up to the top. But it's not quite ready yet, so on day 4, we're going to discard 150 grams of starter and then add 150 grams of flour and 150 grams of water. Then on day 5, we're going to discard 250 grams of starter and add 200 grams of flour and 200 ml of water. At this point though, your starter's still probably not quite ready, and if you were to try to put a piece of starter in a cup of water, it might sink to the bottom. If this happens, just keep feeding your starter every day until it's ready. And the things that tell you when your starter's ready is when it doubles in size a few hours after feeding, and also when it's light enough to float on the top of water. Now you're going to have to keep feeding the microorganisms in your starter, otherwise they'll die. If you keep it at room temperature, you're going to have to keep doing it every day, which is pretty time consuming and it uses a lot of flour, especially if you're only baking occasionally. An alternative is to keep it in the fridge. The cold temperature will slow down the fermentation, and then about once a week you just have to take it out, let it come back to room temperature, feed it and put it back in the fridge again. Then when you want to bake again, take it out the night before and let it come back to room temperature. If it's ready, you can use it straight away, otherwise you might need to feed it again before adding it to your dough. So now that your starter's finally ready, it's time to make some bread. Now when I make sourdough, I like to use 3 different types of flour. For most of the dough, I'm going to use a strong white bread flour. Now the reason we use this for the majority of the dough is that bread flour has a pretty high protein content. The higher the protein content, the more gluten will be formed in the dough, and that'll lead to a loaf of bread with a nice chewy texture. And the other flours I add are more about flavour. I like to use some wholemeal and spelt flour, and they'll just add a few more complex flavours to the final product. So I'm going to add 750 grams of white bread flour, 150 grams of wholemeal flour, and 100 grams of spelt flour. Next we need to hydrate our dough. Now when we add water to flour, it'll hydrate the proteins in the flour and kick off the development of gluten. And the amount of water that we add relative to flour once we factor in our starter is known as a hydration percentage. And different hydration percentages will give us different results. Higher hydration will give rise to a softer bread loaf. It'll also produce a dough that's quite sticky and difficult to work with and shape. Most breads tend to sit between 60 and 70%, and today we're going to aim for around 65. Feel free to play around with the ratios depending on your preference. So to our 1000 grams of flour, we're going to add 580 mils of water and then 400 grams of our sourdough starter. Now the last thing we need to add is some salt. Now salt will help boost the flavour of your bread, and it also plays a role in tightening the gluten structure and adding strength to your dough. And we'll just add about 10 to 12 grams. Now give all those ingredients a mix and turn it out onto a clean bench top. Now most people know that we have to knead the dough to get it to the right texture, but the question's why? Why do we have to physically stretch out the dough, and what's really happening when we do so? Now, as I've touched on before, as we hydrate the dough, we start to form these little chains of gluten. But at this stage, those chains are weak and pretty unorganized. So if we were to pick up the dough and stretch it, the whole structure will just collapse. By kneading the dough, we're realigning these chains into a more organized structure. And this structure is going to be really important to support a strong loaf of bread when we bake it. Now you might find that initially your dough is quite sticky and wet, but please don't add any extra flour. As you knead, the dough is going to become a lot easier to manage, and the more flour you add, the stiffer and heavier your final loaf of bread is going to be. So the idea is just to keep kneading the dough, pushing it out and pulling it back in until it's stretchy enough. The time this takes will be variable, but you'll know it's done when you can pull the dough up, stretch it apart, and it stays together. So I've been kneading for about 15 minutes now, and you can see that the dough's got this really nice smooth texture and it's a lot stretchier. And when we pick it up and we roll it out, it stretches really nicely and it doesn't tear. So now that we've finished kneading our dough, we'll put it all together, pop it in a bowl and let it ferment, which in baking terms is called proofing. Now during proofing is when the yeast and bacteria in the starter will ferment the carbohydrates in the flour and produce that carbon dioxide, which will allow the dough to rise. Now when you do that with baker's yeast, that process happens pretty quickly over about an hour. But when you do it with sourdough, the fermentation's a fair bit slower and it'll take about 3 hours or more. And during this time, we're not just producing gas, we're also breaking down the starches in the flour and making other byproducts like lactic acid, which gives the bread its characteristic sour flavour. So we've come back a few hours later and the dough's actually risen quite significantly, and that's because of the fermentation that's occurred during proofing. At this point, we're going to start shaping the dough into the way that we want to bake it before letting it proof some more. Now you want some kind of vessel to keep your dough roughly in shape so that as it continues to proof, it won't flatten out. I've got these proofing baskets, but you can also use a strainer or a bowl that's lined with a towel. Whichever one you use, make sure you give it a bit of a dusting of flour to help stop the dough sticking to the bottom. Then give your work surface a light coat of flour as well. Then we'll turn out our dough and try to shape it roughly into a round ball. Next we'll want to split this into 2 loaves. Another handy tool is a bench scraper. You can use this to cut straight down the middle, ready to shape into 2 separate loaves. Now to shape the dough, the idea is to start to pull the dough from the top to bottom to tighten up the upper surface of the loaf. So we'll flip it upside down, pull out the edge and wrap it back over towards the center. Keep working around the whole edge of the dough, and with each one, overlap the last. And when you flip it back over, you can see that that tightness is starting to encourage a much more rounded structure compared to before. Next, we'll build that tension more by dragging the dough from the outside underneath itself. Again, working our way around the dough. Once you're done, place it into your basket, upside down, with the tight top side at the bottom of the basket. Now at this point you've got 2 options. You can leave it at room temperature and prove it for another 3 hours, or you can put it in the fridge and leave it overnight. If you're making bread with baker's yeast, it'll tend to overprove in the fridge, but that nice slow sourdough fermentation lends itself perfectly to proving slowly at a low temperature. So I'll put these in the fridge and come back tomorrow morning when they'll be ready to bake. So the dough's been in the fridge overnight, so we'll pull them out and let them get up to room temperature. So you might be asking why bake with sourdough? I mean, you've got to go through all the trouble of maintaining a starter and proofing for hours when you could just use a yeast that's ready to go. And to me, the answer is flavour. I mean, the type of bread that you buy from a supermarket and even most bakeries just doesn't compare to that tangy, complex flavour that you can generate by doing it yourself. When it comes to baking bread, you want to preheat your oven to a really high temperature, at least 230 to 240 degrees. Now, I like to bake in a cast iron casserole dish, just like this. The reason I do that is for the first half of baking, we want the moisture inside the dough to form steam inside the dish. What that does is it allows the dough to rise before we get a nice crust forming on the top. So I've cut out a little piece of baking paper that's roughly the same size as our cast iron dish. We just turn out our dough onto the piece of paper. And you can see that the basket's made this really nice pattern on the surface of the dough. Next, we need to score the dough with a razor blade or a knife. This lets the moisture escape and it allows the dough to change its shape as it rises. You can do whatever pattern you want. This one here is a pretty popular one. Then we pop our loaf into our cast iron pot and put it in the oven. So we'll start by baking the dough with the lid on for about 25 minutes. Then we'll take the lid off and bake it for another 25 minutes. And so after all that time and effort, you're rewarded with a couple of sourdough loaves that look and smell incredible. Now you're going to be really tempted to cut into these straight away and have a slice, but to get the best texture on the inside of the bread, it's really important to let them cool down to room temperature. So we'll come back in 1 to 2 hours and see what they look like inside. Now that the bread's cooled down, it's time to cut it open and see what it looks like inside. And you can see that it's got a really nice looking crumb with all these little holes which were formed by those bubbles of gas that we made during our fermentation. And it's finally time to see how it tastes. The crust is nice and crispy and the bread itself is soft and tangy with a really nice flavour that's well worth the wait. So there you have it, homemade sourdough bread from start to finish. Make sure you check out my previous videos and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more as they come out. And I'll see you next time on Pickels Pickles.